Jeanne Mason, and I'm continuing with the picture of Dorian Gray, continuing with chapter 8. When the sound of their footsteps had died away, Dorian locked the door, put the key in his pocket. He felt safe now. No one would ever look on the horrible thing. No eye but his would ever see his shame. On reaching the library, he found that it was just after 5 o'clock, and that the tea had been already brought up. On a little table of dark perfumed wood, thickly encrusted with macree, a present from his guardian's wife, Lady Radley, who had spent the preceding winter in Cairo, was lying a note from Lord Henry, and beside it was a book bound in yellow paper, the cover slightly torn and the edges soiled. A copy of the third edition of the St. James Gazette had been placed on the tea tray. It was evident that Victor had returned. He wondered if he had met the men in the hall as they were leaving the house, and had wormed out of them what they had been doing. He would be sure to miss the picture, had no doubt missed it already while he had been laying the tea things. The screen had not been replaced, and the blank space on the wall was visible. Perhaps some night he might find him creeping upstairs and trying to force the door of the room. It was a horrible thing to have a spy in one's house. He had heard of rich men who had been blackmailed all their lives by some servant who had read a letter or overheard a conversation or picked up a card with an address or found beneath a pillow a withered flower or a bit of crumpled lace. He sighed, and having poured himself out some tea, opened Lord Henry's note. It was simply to say that he sent him round the evening paper and a book that might interest him and that would be at the club at 8:15. He opened the St. James languidly and looked through it. A red pencil mark on the 5th page caught his eye. He read the following paragraph. Inquest on an actress. An inquest was held this morning at the Bell Tavern, Huxton Road, by Mr. Danby, the district coroner, on the body of Sybil Vane, a young actress recently engaged at the Royal Theatre. Holborn. A verdict of death by misadventure was returned. Considerable sympathy was expressed for the mother of the deceased, who was greatly affected during the giving of her own evidence and that of Dr. Burrell, who had made the post-mortem examination of the deceased. He frowned slightly and, tearing the paper in two, went across the room and flung the pieces into a gilt basket. How ugly it all was, and how horribly real ugliness made things. He felt a little annoyed with Lord Henry for having sent him that account, and it was certainly stupid of him to have marked it with red pencil. Victor might have read it. The man knew more than enough English for that. Perhaps he had read it and begun to suspect something, and yet, what did it matter? What had Dorian Gray to do with Sybil Vane's death? There was nothing to fear. Dorian Gray had not killed her. His eye fell on the yellow book that Lord Henry had sent him. What was it? He wondered. He went towards the little pearl-colored octagon stand that had always looked to him like the work of some strange Egyptian bees who wrought in silver, and took the volume up. He flung himself into an armchair and began to turn over the leaves. After a few minutes, he became absorbed. It was the strangest book he had ever read. It seemed to him that in exquisite raiment and to the delicate sound of flutes, the sins of the world were passing in dumb show before him. Things that he had dimly dreamed of were suddenly made real to him. Things of which he had never dreamed of were gradually revealed. It was a novel without a plot, and only one character being, indeed, simply a psychological study of a certain young Parisian who spent his life trying to realize in the 19th century all the passions and modes of thought that belonged to every century except his own, and to sum it up, as it were, in himself, the various moods through which the world spirit had ever passed, loving for their mere artificiality those renunciations that men had unwisely called virtue, as much as those natural rebellions that wise men still call sin. The style in which it was written was that curiously jeweled style, vivid and obscure at once, full of argot and of archaism, of technical expressions and of elaborate paraphrases that characterizes the work of some of the finest artists of the French school of decadence. There were in it metaphors as monstrous as orchids and as evil in color. The life of the senses was described in the terms of mystical philosophy. One hardly knew at times whether one was reading the spiritual ecstasies of some medieval saint or the morbid confessions of a modern sinner. It was a poisonous book. The heavy odor of incense seemed to cling about its pages and to trouble the brain. The mere cadence of the sentences, the subtle monotony of their music, so full as it was of complex refrains and movements, elaborately repeated, produced in the mind of the lad, as he passed from chapter to chapter, a form of reverie, a melody of dreaming that made him unconscious of the falling day and the creeping shadows. Cloudless and pierced by one solitary star, a copper-green sky gleamed through the windows. He read on by its wan light till he could read no more. Then, after his valet had reminded him several times of the lateness of the hour, he got up and, going into the next room, placed the book on the little Florentine table that always stood at his bedside and began to dress for dinner. Now it was almost 9 o'clock before he reached the club, where he found Lord Henry sitting alone in the morning room, looking very bored. "Oh, I am so sorry, Harry," he cried, "but really, it is entirely your fault. That book you sent me so fascinated me that I forgot what time was." "Well, I thought you would like it," replied his host, rising from his chair. "I didn't say I liked it, Harry. I said it fascinated me. There is a great difference." "Ah, if you had discovered that, you have discovered a great deal," murmured Lord Henry with his curious smile. "Come, let us go in to dinner. It is dreadfully late, and I am afraid the champagne will be too much iced." Chapter 9. For years, Dorian Gray could not free himself from the memory of the book. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that he never sought to free himself from it. He procured from Paris no less than 5 large paper copies of the first edition, and had them bound in different colors so that they might suit his various moods and the changing fancies of a nature over which he seemed at times to have almost entirely lost control. The hero, the wonderful young Parisian in whom the romantic temperament and the scientific temperament were so strangely blended, became to him a kind of prefiguring type of himself. And indeed, the whole book seemed to him to contain the story of his own life, written before he had lived it. In one point, he was more fortunate than the book's fantastic hero. He never knew, never indeed had any cause to know, that somewhat grotesque dread of mirrors and polished metal surfaces and still water, which came upon the young Parisian so early in his life and was occasioned by the sudden decay of a beauty that had once apparently been so remarkable. It was with an utmost cruel joy, and perhaps in nearly every joy, as certainly in every pleasure, cruelty has its place, that he used to read the latter part of the book, with its really tragic, if somewhat overemphasized account of the sorrow and despair of one who had himself lost what in others and in the world he had most valued. He at any rate had no cause to fear that. The boyish beauty that had so fascinated Basil Hallward and many others beside him seemed never to leave him. Even those who had heard the most evil things against him, and from time to time strange rumors about his mode of life crept through London and became the chatter of the clubs, could not believe anything in his dishonor when they saw him. He had always the look of one who had kept himself unspotted from the world. Men who talked grossly became silent when Dorian Gray entered the room. There was something in the purity of his face that rebuked them. His mere presence seemed to recall to them the innocence that they had tarnished. They wondered how one, so charming and graceful as he was, could have escaped the stain of an age that was at once sordid and sensuous. He himself, on returning home from one of those mysterious and prolonged absences that gave rise to such strange conjecture among those who were his friends, or thought that they were so, would creep upstairs to the locked room, open the door with the key that never left him, and stand with a mirror in front of a portrait that Basil Hallward had painted on him, looking now at the evil and aging face on the canvas, and now at the fair young face that laughed back at him from the polished glass. The very sharpness of the contrast used to quicken his sense of pleasure. He grew more and more enamored of his own beauty, more and more interested in the corruption of his own soul. He would examine with minute care, and often with a monstrous and terrible delight, the hideous lines that scarred the wrinkling forehead or crawled around the heavy, sensuous mouth, wondering sometimes which were the more horrible, the signs of sin or the signs of age. He would place his white hands beside the coarse, bloated hands of the picture and smile. He mocked the misshapen body and the failing limbs. There were moments indeed at night when, lying sleepless in his own delicately scented chamber, or in the sordid room of the little ill-famed tavern near the docks, which, under an assumed name and in disguise, it was his habit to frequent, he would think of the ruin he had brought upon his soul, with a pity that was all the more poignant because it was purely selfish. But moments such as these were rare. That curiosity about life that, many years before Lord Henry had first stirred in him, as they sat together in the garden of their friend, seemed to increase with gratification. The more he knew, the more he desired to know. He had mad hungers that grew more ravenously as he fed them. Yet he was not really reckless, at any rate in his relations to society. Once or twice every month during the winter, and on each Wednesday evening, while the season lasted, he would throw open to the world his beautiful house and have the most celebrated musicians of the day to charm his guests with the wonders of their art. His little dinners, in the settling of which Lord Henry always assisted him, were noted as much for the careful selection and placing of those invited as for the exquisite taste shown in the decoration of the table, with the subtle symphonic arrangements of exotic flowers and embroidered cloths, and antique plates of gold and silver. Indeed, there were many. Especially among the very young men who saw or fancied that they saw in Dorian Gray the true realization of a type of which they had often dreamed in Eton or Oxford days, a type that was to combine something of the real culture of the scholar with all the grace and distinction and perfect manner of a citizen of the world. To them, he seemed to belong to those whom Dante describes as having sought to make themselves perfect by the worship of beauty. Like Gautier, he was the one for whom the visible world existed. And certainly to him, life itself was the first, the greatest of the arts, and for it all the other arts seemed to be but a preparation. Fashioned by what is really fantastic becomes, for a moment, universal. And dandyism, which, in its own way, is an attempt to assert the absolute modernity of beauty, had, of course, their fascination for him, his mode of dressing, and the particular styles that he affected from time to time, had their marked influence on the young exquisites of the Mayfair balls and Pall Mall Club windows, who copied him in everything that he did and tried to reproduce the accidental charm of his graceful, though to him only half serious fopperies. For while he was but too ready to accept the position that was immediately offered to him on his coming of age, and found indeed a subtle pleasure in the thought that he might really become to the London of his own day what to imperial Neronian Rome the author of the Satyricon had once been. Yet in his inmost heart he desired to be something more than the mere arbiter elegantarium to be consulted on the wearing of a jewel, or the knotting of a necktie, or the conduct of a cane. He sought to elaborate some new scheme of life that would have its reasoned philosophy and its ordered principles, and find in the spiritualizing of the senses its highest realization. Excuse me. The worship of the senses had often, and with much justice, been decried, men feeling a natural instinct of terror about passions and sensations that seem stronger than ourselves, and that we are conscious of sharing with the less highly organized forms of existence. But it appeared to Dorian Gray that the true nature of the senses had never been understood, and that they had remained savage and animal merely because the world had sought to starve them into submission, or to kill them by pain, instead of aiming at making them elements of a new spirituality, of which a fine instinct for beauty was to be the dominant characteristic. As he looked back upon man moving through history, he was haunted by a feeling of loss. So much had been surrendered into such little purpose. There had been mad, willful rejections, monstrous forms of self-torture and self-denial, whose origin was fear, and whose result was a degradation infinitely more terrible than that fancied degradation from which, in their ignorance, they had sought to escape. Nature, in her wonderful irony, driving the anchorite out to herd with the wild animals of the desert, and the giving to the hermit the beasts of the field as his companion. Yes, there was to be, as Lord Henry had prophesied, a new hedonism that was to recreate life and to save it from the harsh, uncomely puritanism that is having in our own day its curious revival. It was to have its service of the intellect, certainly, yet it was never to accept any theory or system that would involve the sacrifice of any mode of passionate experience. Its aim, indeed, was to be experience itself, and not the fruits of experience, sweet or bitter as they might be. Of the asceticism that deadens the senses, as of the vulgar prolificacy that dulls them, it was to know nothing, but it was to teach man to concentrate himself upon the moment of a life that is itself but a moment. There are few of us who have not sometimes wakened before dawn, either after one of those dreamless nights that make one almost enamored of death, or one of those nights of horror and misshapen joy when through the chambers of the brain sweep phantoms more terrible than reality itself, and instinct with that vivid life that lurks in all grotesque, and that lends to Gothic art its enduring vitality. This art being, one might fancy, especially the art of those whose minds have been troubled with the malady of reverie. Gradually, white fingers creep through the curtains, and they appear to tremble. Black, fantastic shadows crawl into the corners of the room and crouch there. Outside, there is the stirring of birds among the leaves, or the sound of men going forth to their work, or the sigh and sob of the wind coming down from the hills and wandering around the silent house as though it feared to wake the sleepers. Veil after veil of thin, dusky gauze is lifted, and by degrees the forms and color of things are restored to them. And we watch the dawn remaking the world in its antique pattern. The wan mirrors get back their mimic life. The flameless tapers stand where we had left them, and beside them lies the half-read book that we had been studying, or the wired flower that we had worn at the ball, or the letter that we had been afraid to read, or that we had read too often. Nothing seems to us changed. Out of the unreal shadows of the night comes back the real life that we had known. We have to resume it where we had left off, and there steals over us a terrible sense of the necessity for the continuance of energy in the same wearisome round of stereotype habits, or a wild longing it may be, that our eyelids might open some morning upon a world that had been refashioned anew for our pleasures in the darkness, a world in which things would have fresh shapes and colors and be changed or have other secrets, a world in which the past would have little or no place or survive at any rate in no conscious form of obligation or regret, the remembrance even of joy having its bitterness, and the remembrance of pleasure their pain. It was the creation of such worlds as these that seemed to Dorian Gray to be the true object, or among the true objects of life, and in his search for sensations that would be at once new and delightful, and possess that element of strangeness that is so essential to romance, he would often adopt certain modes of thought that he knew to be really alien to his nature, abandon himself to their subtle influence, and then, having, as it were, caught their color and satisfied his intellectual curiosity, leave them with that curious indifference that is not incompatible with a real ardor of temperament, and that, indeed, according to certain modern psychologists, is often a condition of it. It was rumored that once he was about to join the Roman Catholic communion, and certainly the Roman ritual had always had a great attraction for him. The daily sacrifice, more awful really than all the sacrifices of the antique world, stirred him as much by its super rejection of the evidence of the senses as by the primitive simplicity of its elements, and the eternal pathos of the human tragedy that he sought to symbolize. He loved to kneel down on the cold marble pavement with the priest in his stiff flowered cope, slowly and with white hands moving aside the veil of the tabernacle and raising aloft the jeweled lantern shape monstrance with that pallid wafer that at times one would fain think is indeed the panis celestis, the bread of angels, or robed in the garments of the passion of Christ, breaking the host into the chalice and smiting his breast for his sin. The fuming censers that the grave boys in their lace and scarlet tossed into the air like great gilt flowers had their subtle fascination for him. As he passed out, he used to look with wonder at the black confessionals and longed to sit in the dark, dim shadow of one of them and listen to men and women whispering through the tarnished grating the true story of their lives. But he never fell into the error of arresting his intellectual development by any formal acceptance of creed or system, or of mistaking for a house in which to live, an inn that is but suitable for the sojourn of a night, or for a few hours of a night in which there are no stars, and the moon is in travail. Mysticism, with its marvelous power of making common things strange to us, and the subtle antinomianism that always seems to accompany it, moved him for a season, and for a season he inclined to the materialistic doctrines of the Darwinismus movement in Germany, and found a curious pleasure in tracing the thoughts and passions of men to some pearly cell in the brain, or some white nerve in the body, delighting in the conception of the absolute dependence of the spirit on certain physical conditions, morbid or healthy, normal or deceased. Yet, as had been said of him before, no theory of life seemed to him to be of any importance compared with life itself. He felt keenly conscious of how barren all intellectual speculation is when separated from action and experiments. He knew that the senses, no less than the soul, had their mysteries to reveal. And so he would now study perfumes and the secrets of their manufacturing, distilling heavily scented oils and burning odorous gums from the east. He saw that there was no mood of the mind that had not its counterpart in the sensuous life, and set himself to discover their true relations, wondering what there was in frankincense that made one mystical, and in ambergris that stirred one's passions, and in violets that woke the memory of dead romances, and in musk that troubled the brain, and in champak that stained the imagination, and seeking often to elaborate a real psychology of perfumes, and to estimate the several influence of sweet-smelling roots, and scented, pollen-laden flowers of aromatic balms, and of dark and fragrant woods, a spikenard that sickens, of Hovenia that makes men mad, and of aloes that are said to be able to expel melancholy from the soul.